Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Danny Nuttall. You will notice that you are all muted. If you do have any questions about today's webinar or any questions about anything Danny's talking about, then please just pop any questions in the questions bar and Danny will answer them while he's going through. I'm now going to hand you over to Danny.
Hello everyone, my name is Danny Nuttall and I'm a trainer and consultant for itslearning. In this webinar we're going to look at back to school with a Wonde integration. We're going to go through how to have a really smooth end of year and a really smooth start of year as well, which is what we all want to see. I'm the fellow at the bottom right hand side. It is an old picture, which is why I won't be sharing my camera today. Agenda-wise, we're going to go through 5 different points. First of all, we're going to look at how your Wonde integration actually works. Things could be a little bit different for each organisation, but we'll go through it all and just make sure we're very clear and give some context as to the rest of the points. Secondly, we're going to look at who should be involved, so the key people that should be involved in the end of year and the start of year, so that we're all really clear on who we need to work with. The third point, freezing the current integration. This is very much a choice that you can make, but we'll go through the advantages and disadvantages when we reach that point. Fourth, we're going to look at what happens next, and this is very much the start of the new academic year, what we need to do and how that looks. And then 5, we'll just finish with some additional information and a few things to be mindful of. So let's look at how the Wonde integration actually works. There are 3 questions. First of all, what's the ideal organisation that should have an integration? Who should consider having an integration? And what are the alternative options? So we would always recommend that universities and colleges seriously consider having an integration. This is due to the number of learners that they generally have and the fact that campuses are usually over multiple sites or certainly over multiple buildings on most occasions. So obviously the next point, organisations with multiple campuses should also consider an integration. Organisations with dedicated technology teams such as your IT services, your data or MIS teams and your e-learning teams. And this is really helpful when we're trying to configure the integration, set it up and troubleshoot any issues, because we don't have to go through to a third party to do that, which can always get a bit messy, particularly when it comes to communication and fitting everybody's time scales around each other. So it's always great to work with organisations that have these teams in-house. Organisations with over 3,000 learners, obviously due to the sheer number of learners, an integration becomes so much easier for those organisations to manage. So that gives us the question of who should consider having no integration at all. Well, organisations with less than 100 users generally don't need an integration. To manage less than 100 users is quite easy to do, and we can do that off uploading what we would call a CSV file, or even just adding those on individually as they come through the door. Organisations with little support on site or outsourced support teams should consider not having an integration, again just because it can actually be more hassle than it's worth to get everything configured and to start troubleshooting things right when you need it, because you're not sure who to ring or you need to work with somebody else, and especially at back to school it's always everybody being quite busy. So we'd always recommend that organisations with little to no support or outsourced service teams do consider not having integration and managing these things manually. Organisations with a single site Obviously, you've got one site there, so it's a little bit easier to manage the learners within that site. And then we're asking ourselves, do we really need to spend the money on an integration, which can be quite expensive as well? So there's a cost element there as well. Now, that being said, anybody who would like an integration is more than welcome to contact us. We're quite happy to supply an integration, but just bear in mind it may not be quite cost effective. So finally then, what are your alternate options if you don't have an integration? Well, as we've said, we can manually create and remove users ourselves. So our IT leads or our computing leads can take that ability. We can do a CSV upload of users and what we call a manual hierarchy management. And don't worry too much about that terminology just yet. We'll cover that a bit later in this webinar, and we'll also cover it in the next one. So obviously itslearning would support you with either of the above, obviously with service credits or hours purchased, but there are numerous resources created on our support pages that will also support you in this. So that is basically just an overview of who should consider having an integration and who shouldn't. If you don't have an integration and you are looking at a CSV upload or manual creation of users, then it's the next webinar that we will be doing. It's that one that you'd want to watch rather than this one. Okay, so if that is a consideration that you're doing, or if that's the way you're managing your users, then feel free to drop off this one and join the next one. So now we need to look at how the integration actually works. So how your learners, your users, get from your data systems into itslearning. And it's quite simple, I suppose, in this respect. From your school, which in here is your MIS data, so it's the left-hand side one here. That's where all of the users, your courses, your groups, they're all stored within your MIS systems. Okay, so information is housed or homed in your school's data systems. So SIMs and systems like that. What we do then is Wonde comes along and sits in the middle of your school's data system and the itslearning VLE. The information is sent to Wonde, where it's organized and converted in a format that itslearning would understand. This secures your information and allows both parties to allow or restrict different bits of data. Okay, so some of you may have users being what we call provisioned, users being replicated in itslearning and put in their groups, but you might not have courses. So again, this sort of Wonde middleware client is what makes everything that bit safer, that bit more secure, and translates the language of your MIS data system into the language of the itslearning system. And then Wonde sends that data to itslearning. Okay, now it may be with some data systems where your MIS system sends it to Wonde, but Wonde can also what we call grab it from the data as well. So depending on your MIS platform, is whether or not that gets passed or fetched, I suppose is the correct term. But don't worry about how that works, I guess. Just know that it's going to Wonde. Wonde is providing that bit of security, it's providing that translation, and it's sending it over to itslearning. Itslearning then receives the correct format and replicates users in the platform. We also use this information to add users to our hierarchy groups, create courses within itslearning. They can also be based off master templates, and we add those users to the courses ready for start of year. Okay, so we take that information and we basically do a lot more with it to set up your site. Okay, so the users, courses and groups get pushed from your data system to Wonde, which is the middleware client. That's where the magic happens. And then they get pushed again to itslearning, where we use that data to set up your platform. So now let's take a look at who should be involved in this process. So first of all, your organization's data team will need to be involved. They are responsible for working with Wonde to update the data views to the new year, and then obviously to make sure or double check that Wonde is still reading them after that update. Looking just at the bottom, the itslearning integrations team, they will be responsible for taking the data that Wonde has provided us with and making it work as planned or as expected even within itslearning. And then we also have your organization's lead and the itslearning project manager. So the organization's lead is responsible for the planning of the back to school process alongside the itslearning project manager, and the itslearning project manager alongside the organization's lead is also responsible for this as well. So you have that strategic oversight, you have the senior leadership and a project manager laying out how it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, getting those dates in place, and then just making sure that on the school side, on the organisation side, the data team are on track with their side of things, and the itslearning project manager is doing exactly the same on the side of itslearning and making sure that our integrations team is prioritising as and when your organisation require it. So we're now moving on to freezing the integration. So when we're talking about freezing the integration, we have to ask ourselves 4 main questions. When, why, how, and timescale, which is basically how long the integration is going to be frozen for. So let's start with the when. An integration should be frozen when learners have finished for the summer holidays, but before any changes to the data systems from the MIS teams. So this means that if there's any learner that still needs to complete work, that should be done before we freeze the integration, and the data teams need to wait for the integration to be frozen before they start making updates to the views. So what this does obviously is it stops any learner from being moved from their old class to their new class, and obviously losing access potentially to the work or the course that they've been working on. And that's why, or that's part of the why that we do it. So when does it have to be frozen? Once all the learners have finished their work, but before the MIS and data teams start to roll over the views to the new year. So now we move on to why. We spoke a tiny bit about this already, and it's to allow for the data teams to switch over to the new year. So we stop or we freeze the integration, the data teams do their job, and then we can start to re-enable that and get all the updates, which we'll talk about shortly. So a few more reasons here is to update the views used by Wonde. So sometimes these views have years in them or academic years specified, and we might just need to change that year over to the new one, which means that we need to speak to Wonde and let them know that we're doing that. We need to stop courses and users being deleted from the VLE before the right time. So again, just looking at that, what we were saying earlier, the learner has have to finish their work before we start this process, because if they are deleted or if they are moved, they could lose access to that work. Okay, so that's not something we want to happen. And again, right at the end here, so to stop new users being added before the data team are ready for them to be. Okay, so to stop that new intake of learners being put on the platform before we're ready for them to go on there. So if we're still dealing with groups or we're still looking at bursaries and things like that, we don't want them all added before we're ready for it, basically. So that brings us to the how. Really easy on this one. contact our support team. Let them know when you want the integration to be frozen. Okay, so this can be done in advance. You can send them an email and say, in 2 weeks' time, could you freeze my integration, or could you do it, as soon as possible, and that sort of thing. It's always best, if you are going to ask for a time, we really need to stick to it, okay? Because otherwise it can cause a lot of confusion about, which date you want, or if 2 or 3 people are saying different dates, that's also confusion. And that brings us back to that who should be involved slide that we spoke about earlier. So you don't have to stop the integration. But if you don't stop it, users will be added and removed ad hoc by your data system and not by you. Okay, so that means that if we leave it running and learners are logging in, one day they'll log in and they'll see one thing, the next day they might see a completely different thing. And obviously we're not giving ourselves the time or the headspace to make sure everything's right before we then roll out the learners. So it is possible, we can do it, but it's not something we recommend. So the length of inactivity is very much up to you. We'd recommend unfreezing the integration as soon as possible after the data team have rolled over their systems. So their systems and views to the new academic year. So as soon as the data team have done it, get on the phone or send an email and let us know that we can start to roll this out. Do unfreeze before the new intake of learners start at the organisation, because then they can be being added as they're enrolled, so little bit by little bit, and the ones that are still on there will just be updated. Okay, so this stops any problems that might occur in that process, which we will talk about later. So we've looked at how we can freeze those integrations and stop learners being updated and stop any sort of confusion there. But what happens when we want to start getting them on, when we want to start dealing with that new academic year? So once your data team have completed the work, you'll need to let us know to switch the itslearning integration back on. You can do this in advance if you like, but please be as accurate as possible as not to cause any confusion in the process. And what we mean by that is, if you're going to sort of email us and say, on August 20th, we'd like this turned back on, and then something happens or you get held up with something and you forget to tell us that you don't want it turned back on at that point, that can obviously cause confusion. Or if you keep ringing us or emailing us every day, changing your dates, then that can be an issue as well. Now, obviously, we know that certain things happen. There are difficulties that occur and things like that. So don't worry if this is something you have to do. We're just asking to try and be as precise as possible, basically, because obviously it just makes everything a bit simpler, especially when we're dealing with schools that, we have 10 or 11 that have the same, very similar names and things like that. So it does help us out quite a lot. We will activate the integration at the agreed date, and your learners and groups will populate and update in itslearning. So again, like we've said before, it's as simple as telling us, and we'll get that sorted for you. So you might have chosen to have your course populated from your MIS system each year. If you've chosen this option, then you'll have a choice to make. First of all, will last year's courses be deleted, or will they be archived? If you want to keep last year's courses, you'll need to check the option for course archiving. You'll need to allow the old courses to be archived rather than deleted. So to do this, we go into the itslearning platform, we go to Admin on the top menu bar, we click on our global settings, we select Features and Security, and there's a title heading under there for synchronization, and you'll find a tick box there that you need to tick for course archiving. This will archive old courses that are no longer in your MIS system, and it will do that instead of deleting them. Okay, so this is a choice that is very individual to each organization. It's whether or not you feel you need to keep those courses for a year, 2 years, or whether or not those courses can be deleted. We do need to consider how much storage space you have though. So what we find as a rule of thumb is that a lot of primary schools and the majority of sort of average size high schools are generally okay to archive for a year. But for those that are slightly bigger and for colleges and stuff, we may need to watch our storage space. So if you are a bit concerned, contact your key account manager. They can walk you through checking how much storage space you're using at the moment and what that may roughly likely go up to, and we can decide from there whether we need a little bit more, whether we want to go with a purchase of unlimited storage, or whether we can get some advice or some ideas on how we can keep storage down. So for example, deleting the trash cans in your courses before the archiving process would help a lot with that. So there's some choices to be made, and it's basically whether or not you want to keep your old courses or you're happy for them to be deleted. So now we come to the information on the major change filter. We have mentioned this a few slides ago, but it's great now to get into it a bit deeper so that we understand it, because this is something that we need to be aware of and we really need to understand. So when your integration gets unfrozen or de-iced, if we're being cool about it, you may likely encounter our safety mechanism, which we've named the major change filter. The filter is in place to make sure that major changes in your data are flagged before being pushed to itslearning. This ensures that if there are any change issues on your data systems, then itslearning will not be effective. Okay, so just like we were talking about when we spoke about freezing that data, it gives us the time to get everything right, get everything working, do our quality assurance checks before we start pushing that new view to Wonde, and before Wonde start allowing itslearning to collect it. The filter will send you an email after each time an update from your MIS system runs, and it will inform you of whether a status is okay or status failed. And we'll get onto that in the next slide. We do have a max threshold for changes allowed, which we set to 10%, and this is 10% of person, group and hierarchy records. Okay, so this almost always happens for integrations that are coming in and starting afresh, because we've got a new enrollment of learners. So we could have a couple of hundred learners starting, and usually there's more than 10% of changes when we have that. Okay, so can't stress enough, keep your eyes open for the emails coming through from our itslearning integrations team. Will look a little something like this, and we can see on the left hand side probably is a little bit small, but don't worry, but this is an idea of the format of the email that you'll get. So it's quite technical, and most of this data is basically just letting you know and checking what's been updated and how much of that's been updated. So if it's groups that's been updated, if it's hierarchies, and the percentage of change that's happened. And remember that figure of 10%, because this is where it starts to come in handy to know that. So the only bit that really matters is this bit at the bottom, and this is the important bit. So what we've done is we've magnified this on the right hand side for you. So as it's coming on, we can see that it's got positive group changes, updates, and all that sort of stuff. Now, the important bit of this is right here at the bottom. Okay, so it's telling us that in this instance, it's aborted the import. Okay, and it's telling us at 1:46 a.m. the import had too many group updates. It had 13.21%, and as we've just said, the magic number for us is 10%. Okay, so because it went over there, it stopped the import, and it will have sent you this email. So what you'll need to do is, if it's aborted the import, you contact us at support, and if it hasn't aborted it, if it's gone through as okay, we're generally okay. If you do encounter that major change filter, what do we do? Well, if the status is okay, we do nothing. Fantastic. But if the status is failed, then we contact the support team. Okay, so I know I've said this before, but I just wanted to go over it again and just get that through, because you're not on your own. It can be a bit daunting when you see these messages. So I've magnified that last little bit where it said that it was aborting the operation, the import. If it does say it's aborting the import, give us a call. After that first time, it should then say that it's all been imported, or it's been imported successfully. And we can see again here it's 13.21% over, and really we only allow a 10% change before we end that import. So as soon as it exceeds 10%, we just abort. So now let's take a look just at some additional information to be mindful of when we're using less known about features or less known about integrations. So last but not least, finally should I say, there are things that we need to maybe consider with some of our imports, and these are things that are not going to be relevant to all of you and not even to the majority of you, but it's something that obviously a few users might have in place, and so we wanted to cover that in this webinar just to let you know what to do. Okay, so a few things to be mindful of with the atom-wide single sign-on. So we've got some of you guys using atom-wide. We need to make sure that all students have correct UPN numbers in your MIS system, because the USO, because atom-wide needs this to match the learners in the platforms to allow them for that single sign-on. Need to keep an eye on the manual matching that is still pending in your USO portal. So if a learner can't get onto the platform yet, if their single sign-on's not working, we need to check that atom-wide portal first and just make sure that nobody's pending in there. If they're not, then we can contact our support team. But usually they'll still be pending. On the other side here, we also have some people using terms. If you do use any of the itslearning features relating to terms, then do contact your key account manager. Okay, so if you're using things like terms, the attendance feature, particularly if it's the attendance 2.0 and not the newer one, or the behavior feature, then please contact your key account manager. They will support you and they will find out what you need to do. So we'll handle those integrations and those customers on an individual basis as they come, because we know there's very few people using terms in that respect. So I hope that's quite clear. If there is anything that you want to know about or find out about, you've got a whole host of resource. You can contact our support team, you can contact your key account managers, and obviously keep coming back to these slides and just reading through them and listening to my voice, trying not to fall asleep. So that's it for this slide. Thanks very much for attending. Thanks for watching. I really hope it's been helpful to you, and I will see you in the next one.
Thank you, Danny. Just to add, if there are any more questions, you can pop them in the questions box. I don't see any at the moment. This email, this webinar will be sent out, the recording, so that should be sent out hopefully by the end of the day, if not first thing tomorrow. But as Danny said, if you do have any questions in the meantime, please just pop support a message. Danny, oh, I've got a question coming in. Let's just have a quick look. Just from Danny, just to say thanks for everyone for attending. Danny, have you got anything else to sort of add to that?
No, I think it's hopefully covered it quite well. But if there is any questions, if anyone does sort of reread it or watch it again and there's got a bit of confusion, then like I say, either just get in touch with us, get in touch with your account manager or support. We're all here to help you. We're all here to support you.
We've just got a question coming, Danny. So if you update your MIS system at the start of summer, but does not go live until the start of September, then do we unfreeze at the start of September?
So it's up to you. As long as your data team have finished all the work that they need to do, then it really doesn't matter when you unfreeze. As long as, like we say, the data team are happy that they've completed their work.
Thank you, Danny. And Rachel said thank you as well. Any more questions? We'll just give it another sort of minute. Okay. How long does it take from unfreeze to sync New Year, please?
So what usually happens is if you ask us to unfreeze something on let's say a Wednesday, we'll put that request through and it'll be Wednesday, well, Thursday early morning, about 1 AM, 1:30, before the updates go through. So it will technically be the day after that you'll see learners start to come into the platform. Just to elaborate on that slightly there, it's at that point, after that first import, that's when you want to be looking out for that major change filter email. So just be mindful of that. When you do sort of say, turn it back on, the next morning you will likely have an email there with that major change filter. So just keep your eyes peeled for it.
Great, thanks, Danny. Okay, well, I don't think we've got any more questions, but as I said, we'll send this recording out hopefully by today, if not first thing tomorrow. But you can always contact support and your account manager if you've got any more questions. But thanks ever so much for everyone attending, and hopefully we'll speak to you all soon.